Welcome to DrJLT Economics. I'm Dr. Julin. In today's video, I want to talk about the exorbitant privilege and the fall of the Soviet Union. It is based on an article that I've just written on my blog, and it is also an idea that I talked about last month during my previous video. The general idea of this, I will tell you exactly how I got this idea to write this piece, right? It was from a video that I watched where the guy was talking about the Triffin dilemma. Although I think his description of the Triffin dilemma was not necessarily the best. I think he made a very interesting point about the exorbitant privilege, and this led me to have more, to put more thoughts onto the matter, and this is exactly what I have written. So basically, I'm going to go over the main points that I have made in this article, and then I will give some comments. And maybe in the end, I will also link it to the Triffin dilemma. So generally, we all know, I think most people most adults have some faint idea of the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union. And often it is ascribed to the inefficiencies of the planned economy, of the corrupt system, the inefficient system, the leaders, the hubris of the leaders, right? So those were the points that have been made, and I will concur that these points are valid points, but these are not necessarily the fundamental reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see, for a nation, for a country to collapse, especially in the sudden manner in which the Soviet Union did, there need to be not only internal factors, but also external factors. And the most important external factor is the one that most people in the West do not wish to discuss, and that is the US dollar. Especially Americans, they never want to discuss this. They want to talk about freedom. They want to say that it is because that they have freedom that this led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, exactly how they could be, that's just because you are free and the others are not free, that their country collapses. That is, of course, not a logic argument. Rather, the reason that the Soviet Union collapsed, as I made out in this article, as I point out in this article, a very important factor is the exorbitant privilege that the United States enjoys. So basically what happened was that, you see, before the Vietnam War, every time the US needed to engage in any war efforts, they always increased taxes, and they sold bonds to their own citizens, and then they funded their war efforts. This was true in the Civil War. This was true in the Spanish War, American-Spanish War. It was true in World War I, and it was also true in World War II, right? It was also true in the Korean War. And this was, you see, when a lot of people who are, I think, a little bit disingenuous when they talked about currently there were some left-wing economists when they talk about the tax brackets in at the end of the Eisenhower era, how high it was compared to now. They were disingenuous in the sense that at that point the tax rate was high because they were using it to fund the war, the Korean War. But afterwards, they changed their funding method. They changed it. They decided in the 1960s to instead print money and spend, because obviously raising taxes, especially to 90% income tax, which was already very silly rate, there is not much room to increase more. You can't confiscate 100%. At which point the already very hard civil scene, right, in the United States is going to be even more turbulent. So instead, what they did was they lowered the taxes, but instead started to tax by inflation. So they used the JFK, LBJ, used the Federal Reserve to fund the Apollo program, the moon landing, right? The various social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and of course the Vietnam War. And this was the fundamental reason that led to the stagflation of the 1970s, right? They want to say that it was there was this, what is it called? The oil crisis, Saudi Arabia, this and that, the Middle East. Those were factors, but the fundamental reason was that the United States printed more money than they could, and when the 1970s came around, they had a lot more obligations than they had gold. So this was the point at which they decoupled the US dollar from the gold standard. And it was from this point onwards, from the 1970s, they were just simply printing money at will, right? That was a very important point, right? This was also the turning point of the start of the stagflation, of the stagnation in the Soviet Union. The difference, of course, is that the Soviet Union did not have a global reserve currency. Every resource that they needed to import, they need to make themselves, and everything that they cannot make themselves needs to be paid for by hard work of them, so that they do themselves, right? So they have to earn dollar first, and then they can buy things that they cannot make. The United States, on the other hand, can when things that they cannot make or do not care to make, are not very profitable for them to make, they don't make it. They just buy, they print money and buy, right? And for things that they are making, they also get cheap resources, right? Because however, the dollar amount of the resources, the dollar price of the resources, they were able to basically print the money and get the resources virtually for free. But it is more insidious than that. A very important part that also is often overlooked is that, a lot of American this time is right-wing economists who are, again, disingenuous. They like to say that the United States is, losing in trade, right? But they are actually not losing in trade. They are actually, it's actually there is a trade balance, right? There is always a trade balance, except that what they are exporting is the dollars. So they export paper, they export numbers, while they import goods and services. That was the thing, right? So they were able to inflate, right? All the world's excess GDPs, let's say, or excess money, right? I don't quite know in the number. In 1970, I think the world's GDP is less than 10% of what it is today, much lower perhaps. I don't quite know the numbers. I should have checked, but anyway, I think it's very easy for anyone to check, right? And to look at how much money there were in the world, and all the addition money that's in circulation, every single cent comes from the United States. every wealth that every other country makes, every bit of wealth that every other country produces, the United States first buys, right? This is the process of the US dollar-based global reserve system. So this allows the Americans to not only buy things for free, but also they were able to export inflation. They exported inflation, and this inflation damaged the economies of the Eastern Bloc. Of course, it was inefficient. Of course, they lagged behind in computer sciences, in semiconductors, which was a huge, I would say, a huge huge mistake, a strategic mistake by the Soviet Union. So they lagged behind in macro in semiconductors, and this really led to a dramatic difference in productivity, compounded with the exported inflation by the United States, and the fact that they have to earn all the resources, so they cannot print themselves out of any trouble. All these issues combined led to the final collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, what is the lesson that we can learn today? Well, I think the very important lesson, perhaps the most important lesson, was that for the USSR to build up its military with the hope of, or with the vision of some hot war with the United States was foolish. It was stupid, right? So what they should have instead focused on and understood better was the risks posed by the US dollar. And so if they had this understanding, they probably could have fared better. But it was a completely different time, and because the US dollar, the US economy was still very strong, the US industry was very, very strong, I doubt that even having this knowledge, the Soviet Union would have had any good measures in dealing with it. But they perhaps could have avoided the Cold War, right? They could have avoided the Cold War, perhaps by investing merely in some nuclear deterrence, and then just focusing more on their domestic economies. That would have been a much better approach if they had focused primarily in raising the living standards of their citizens, if they had focused primarily in increasing the economic efficiency of their industries, all right, if they had focused instead on technologies that had global markets that would have helped them establish more bilateral trade agreements, perhaps circumventing the US dollar. If these were the case, the Soviet Union might not have collapsed. Now, so given that these knowledge today, I think, this is what I've written in this article, I think what we could do, perhaps, if any country wants to avoid or mitigate the risks from another Cold War, was to de-dollarize. But to de-dollarize would need three elements, right? First, a global settlement system independent of the US dollar that is secure, stable, quick, and widely available, right? This requires the participation of banks from a large number of countries, major economies. I think this is very difficult as of now to achieve. Secondly, it will necessitate a global reserve currency alternative that is liquid and backed by real assets. And by real asset, I mean gold. I think gold is perhaps the only real asset that is recognized by every civilization. Perhaps not so much the United States, because they probably don't have much gold, and they have instead dollars, so they don't want to talk about gold. Of course, I know that they supposedly have the world's largest gold reserve, but at the same time, as many people have pointed out, it also hasn't been audited in 70 years, so we don't know if how much gold there is. But nevertheless, the thing is that gold is an essential asset. Gold has real value. It has use cases, particularly today, because if we talk about it is extremely good. It has in conducting heat. No, actually, it's not conducting heat. In radiation prevention, all right, radiation shielding, right? So it is used in semiconductors. It is used in aerospace. It is used in satellites. A lot of things. So it has a lot of real use cases now. Previously, it was just a metal that doesn't tarnish, that shines very beautifully. But currently, it has more uses, and I think as more demanding applications of electronics and aerospace technologies evolve, the application of gold will be more broad, and so this for sure is a real asset. It's so that is something that is very important, right? Again, I think this is very difficult because I don't think if the US dollar is to be replaced, it will be replaced by such a trustworthy global reserve currency alternative. And thirdly, I think it's also very important to have a major commodities exchange, right, that uses this reserve currency alternative and serves a significant amount of the most important global resources. Again, I think this is very difficult. Having said all these things, the point I want to make is that, well, the 2020s is shaping up to be a part replay of the 1970s. The scripts is different. The scripts are different. This time, it happens when the U.S. is partially deindustrialized. It's not completely deindustrialized. It's not like the United Kingdom, which basically has nothing, right? It has a phony service-based economy. It has money laundering, tax evasion, and not much else. The United States still has great industries. It still has the world's best research institutions. It still has some of the brightest minds in the world, whether it is in sciences, in technology, in economics, or in political sciences. So obviously the United States is in much stronger position, but it is not as strong as it was in the 1970s. And then it is also at a time when there is 0% interest rate and unsustainable levels of US national debt and a gigantic everything bubble that's been filled by quantitative easing. The problem with this is that, you see, when actually I have already mentioned, I've discussed this in detail extensively on this channel, so I would encourage you to look at some of those videos that I have made on this channel. So basically, the general idea is very simple, and I think a lot of people have talked about this on financial media, perhaps not CNBC's at all, but you know, on the more reliable sources. And it's very simple. You see, the Federal Reserve can fight inflation by raising interest rates, just like Paul Volcker did in 1980. But the problem is that to do that, it is important. And by the way, now a lot of people say that real inflation in the United States is very likely to be 10% this year, right? And the CPI says it's almost perhaps going to be 5%. We're going to see. Last month has been really bad, and I think it's probably going to get worse. Current account deficit is going to be bad. So all these things, what can the Federal Reserve do? Well, the only thing they can do to fight inflation is to raise interest rate. There's nothing else they can do. But if they raise the interest rate, what happens is that the U.S. national debt will become unserviceable. Right? The United States government is never able to balance its budget. It's never able, of course, to pay back its debt. The best it can do is roll over its debt and not increase it. But to roll over its debt at 20% interest rate, it's going to be a humongous increase in its debt burden, right? So this will lead to big problems. So it become very obvious that the United States needs to borrow even more money to pay its interest, right? It could will lead to more problems in the loss of confidence in the US dollar. So it's not necessary in this case that when you raise interest rates, you can fight inflation, because if you raise interest rates and the US dollar, the US government has to borrow a lot of money from the Federal Reserve to finance these debts, just to pay the interest, then of course international investors will completely lose confidence in the US dollar. They will completely lose confidence in the ability of the US government to pay back its debt. And what then happens is that they will sell the dollar, which would make the purchasing power of the US dollar further decrease. And as the purchasing power of the US dollar decreases, the inflation of the dollar will actually worsen. So by raising interest rate, they may not even be able to fight inflation. Right? This is a situation that is very unique, and also, of course, there are a lot of zombie companies who have borrowed a lot of money and they cannot pay back their debt. All they can do is roll over their debt. And again, the same dynamics. A lot of companies going bankrupt, stock market going to collapse, and what can happen then is, of course, people will sell their dollar-denominated assets, and then they will exit the U.S. financial markets. And then in this process, they will sell the dollar. And again, of course, the U.S. dollar will decrease in value. So basically, in general, if the Federal Reserve raises interest rate, they may still not be able to fight inflation, and may actually make it worse. Now, at the same time, if they don't fight inflation, nothing is there to stop it. So what can happen is only increasing inflation. There's going to be more and more inflation, and then people will lose confidence in the US dollar. A lot of people will hedge against US dollars currency risks, and then what happens is that we will see another decline, of course, in the purchasing power of the US dollar, right? So basically, doesn't matter what the Federal Reserve does or does not do. It's trapped in what people say is between a rock and a hard place. There is no place to go, and so what they can do is to sustain the current bubble as long as possible, to prevent the reckoning, and hope that maybe some miracle will come along. But I don't think that they have a clear strategy in getting out of this. Personally, I think what the United States government and the Federal Reserve are doing is to borrow as much money as possible to build up their infrastructure, to build up their military, to build up their international influence as much as possible before the US dollar finally collapses and ceases to become the world's reserve currency. They possibly, I think very likely, sees this just as I do, because I'm not a very smart person. They must be smarter. They must see that this is an inevitable outcome. So what they are doing now is to basically get the last what is it called? To make the last round of money or whatever before the game stops, right? So that's what they are. I think what they are doing. Now, in this context, I think the key for any country to mitigate the consequences of another Cold War is absolutely not to engage in a Cold War with the United States, because if you try to engage in a Cold War, if you try to unseat the US dollar, it is very difficult. It is very costly. It can cost not just money, but also your international influence. And it's actually going to be a losing proposition. Rather, I think a wise alternative is to build the three elements that I mentioned in this article, right? To build a global settlement system that is independent of the dollar, so that when the dollar collapses, this settlement system can take over. To build a global reserve currency alternative backed by perhaps gold, right, with a fixed exchange rate mechanism, and this will basically be more compelling and project confidence in the global economy. And as the US dollar collapses, this will be the alternative that takes over. Nobody needs to control this. Nobody alone needs to control this global reserve currency alternative. Rather, it should be a fair system that every country can benefit from it, because it is more efficient. It does not come with risks, with currency risks and political risks of using the US dollar. Lastly, of course, it is also very important to have major commodities exchanges outside of London, outside of the United States, right? So that and uses this reserve currency alternative, so that when the dollar collapses, when of course the pound collapses with it, right? Because it's just an offshoot, the 51st state of the United States. When they collapse, there will be a working, functioning system that ensures minimal shock to the global economy, right? Because if you are able to insulate yourself from the currency risks and the political risks in the United States, when the currency and political risks in the United States really goes out of control, this is where this new system can take over. So the key here is rather not to attack the US dollar, but rather to be prepared for the final collapse of the US dollar, because the Federal Reserve and the US government are trapped in its current position with no way out. And as I say, as currency risks rise in the US and lowers with these measures abroad, the current account and inflationary pressures on the USD will hasten its disarmament, right? So if the world economy, if other major economies will be able to insulate themselves from the risks of the US dollar, they will actually become more attractive for international investors, right? It will be more attractive to capitals. And as a result, what will happen is that they will actually hasten, will disarm the US dollar. And I don't mean this as a way to say that, the Americans are screwed, like some doomers want to say, doomers and gloomers. Rather, I want to say that this is actually going to be a great thing for the Americans, because I think the Americans are productive people. I think it is rather some interest groups that in the United States that may suffer, of course, with the displacement of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, with the fact that Wall Street will no longer be basically laundering the world's wealth and taking a big cut out of it. The standard of living in the United States will be lower than it is now, but it will still be very high, and I think employment opportunities in the United States in time will actually improve for working class peoples. Their living standards may actually improve. Well, the dollar price of housing or whatever is not something that we can talk about, we can forecast, but the gold price of housing, of food, of necessities in life in the United States may actually be lower in the future, because the gigantic bubble that's been inflated by money printing out of thin air will end. So I think overall it is the rest of the world who stand to win. It is the American workers who stand to win, and some select special interest groups who may stand to lose. All right. So thank you very much for listening to this recording, or if you are watching this on some video platforms, thank you as well. If you're interested, find this article on my website, DrJLT.com, and I will of course share the link. You can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. Julin Teng. Thank you very much, and have a great day.